This forecast includes information through the end of March. Things are changing very quickly. A lot has changed since then. What downside risks to growth and perhaps upside risks to inflation have developed since then?
Well, first, Kaylee, great to meet you and very happy to be here. In terms of our revisions to output growth in our new World Economic Outlook, the dominant factor is the war. And that's true for the baseline, but that's true also for the downside risk. So when we think about the downside risk to the global economy, an escalation of the war or a tightening of the sanctions, in particular an extension of the sanctions to energy trade, energy exports from Russia, would have a significant impact on global output and on output in neighboring countries, in particular in Europe. That's not the only downside risk that the economy is facing. There's also potentially a stronger slowdown in China. We've heard the numbers coming out yesterday and the measures that have been taken, announced just this morning. There's also the risk that inflation might be more elevated than what we've had and require more tightening from central banks. But the war comes first.
Yeah. Pierre-Olivier, good morning to you. How weak would European growth become if we did see a ban on imports of Russian gas? Do you have a range of outcomes, a range of possibilities? Any sense of how weak that growth story could be?
Well, a lot of people are looking at that very question right now, including in our own institution. The key issue there is that it would be very difficult to substitute part of the natural gas that Europe is importing from Russia through pipelines in the short term, so within 1 or 2 years. And so that would have a serious impact on prices. It would have a serious impact on activity in the region. We have, in our report, we've run an adverse scenario situation where we imagine that the sanctions are stronger on energy exports from Russia, accompanied by other factors like more financial instability and maybe a weakening of consumer confidence around the world. And when we run the scenario, we have a much larger decline in output. We anticipate for the global economy that output would be 2% lower. That's a level effect. That's not a growth effect by the end of 2023. And for the euro area, it would be about 3% lower by the end of 2023. So quite sizable effects. But let's realize that there's an enormous amount of uncertainty in making this kind of prediction. So we have to be humble in terms of understanding this.
So obviously there is a lot of uncertainty, but if you were playing the odds right now, where do you put them on the likelihood of a recession in Europe in particular?
Well, as of now, given where the sanctions are and have been, and despite some of the adjustments in the sanctions since then, the really big piece would be extending the sanctions to energy export from Russia. Until that happens, I think our baseline projections are reasonable. They anticipate a significant slowdown in Europe to about 2.8%. In some countries, it's an even stronger slowdown. Germany, for instance, we anticipate 2.1% growth. It's a 1.7 percentage point revision from January. So it's quite significant. But it still stays in positive territory, although it's a much softer level of activity.
Can I ask you about the Russian economy, Pierre-Olivier? Because President Putin likes to point at the resilience, the rebound in the Russian ruble and say, look, that's evidence that the Russian economy has survived the attack of sanctions. That's the way he sees it. Of course, the sanctions threat could increase. Where do you put the pain and the resilience of the Russian economy right now? How negatively affected by sanctions do you think it will be?
Oh, the Russian economy is very strongly and negatively affected by the sanctions that are in place already. I mean, we are projecting a double-digit revision in output growth for Russia, 11.5% percentage point revision. So growth for Russia is predicted at negative 8.5%. In 2022, so it's very, very significant. And it's largely coming from the contraction in imports and the financial sanctions that have been put in place on Russia, excuse me. And so here, clearly, what is very important to realize is that with financial flows are basically cut off, the ruble and the value of the ruble doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really reflect the impact, negative impact that the sanctions have inflicted on the Russian economy.
All right, Pierre-Olivier, let's talk about China now, as we just touched on Russia. You've cut the China growth forecast to 4.4%. That's down from 4.8%. How much downside risk is there in that economy in particular, given that there is no sign of a let-up in its zero tolerance for COVID?
Yeah, so we have a mild revision downward in our projection for China from 4.8% to 4.4. So it's 4.4 is quite a bit below the authorities' target of 5.5 for 2022. So we are projecting a softer level of activity in China in 2022. And this is largely driven by three factors. One is, as you pointed out, Omicron lockdowns that have been extended and are already factored in our baseline, although we anticipate them to be rather localized and temporary. Then there is a softening of external demand. The rest of the world is not doing as strongly, and therefore China is affected. It's an export-oriented economy. And third, there is also some trouble brewing at home in terms of the property sector, and that's also weighing down on output. Now, going forward, the zero COVID policy is something that has served China very, very well in terms of number of cases and number of deaths in the past 2 years. But it's, of course, harder to maintain when you have a more virulent strain of the virus like Omicron is. And it's especially problematic when you have a high fraction of your elderly population that is not vaccinated yet. And so China is sort of in a race to try to close this vaccination gap so that it can be less vulnerable. But that's something that is causing right now. At the same time,
Pierre-Olivier, sorry, finish your thought. Apologies, I'm sorry for interrupting. I wanted to ask you about something else that I know comes up in your report today, and that is about reshoring of operations, so maybe from China or other places back to Western economies. To what extent do you think reshoring is a solution for supply chain fragility, or does it bring fragilities and maybe inflationary pressures of its own?
Well, reshoring can be part of a process of trying to secure some supplies and sort of to make sure that you have energy security and things like that. And we're not taking a stand on issues of national security. But more broadly, we think about the global economy as it's been developing over the last 75 years, a fairly integrated global supply chains that involve most countries in the world. This is something that has been extraordinarily beneficial to pretty much the entire global population. It has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. It has helped emerging markets grow very fast and become what they are today and on the path to become even larger in the future. So we are concerned that a process of de-globalization would unravel some of these gains that have been achieved over time, lead to efficiency losses, potentially more volatility, more disruptions, and potentially leave economies more vulnerable, not less vulnerable. This is something that we have actually analyzed in some detail in our latest report.